And first of all, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us, and also online for joining us online. And I want to acknowledge that this land is a land taken from Indigenous peoples, that they knew how to manage, and they know how to manage the land much better than we do. And I want to thank all of the ancestors and all of the people before us who are with us, and remind ourselves that we are just stewards on this land and we don't control it. We are part of it and we're just one. And I want to thank the ancestors and everybody who's joining us in this gathering. With that said, what we're going to do is Kenny is going to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that he's been researching and races coming up over the next couple of years. And then Blair is going to talk about the initiative to institute ranked choice voting in Oregon. And then Meek from the Independent Party is going to speak about the implementation of Measure 107 on campaign finance reform. If you want to speak, what I suggest is for you to write it on the chat, and we'll keep a stack, we'll keep track of who wants to speak. And little by little, we'll follow that list and let you speak. We're going to let the speakers present their complete presentation and take questions at the end of their presentation. And then at the end of this section, we'll have a roundtable general discussion. Anybody has a question? Okay, Kenny, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks everyone. Sorry I don't have video, but computer problems. So I've just been doing a little bit of research about some of the upcoming elections. Next year, obviously, we primarily have local elections. So that's going to be your city and county offices. Unfortunately, I've looked at all 36 county election websites, and they're probably going to be updating over the next couple of weeks or going into January, because we've never had an election at the local level, except for very small ones, in March after a presidential election. So that they don't have criteria to have it out this early. So beyond that, going into the 2022 election, which is the big one for our state, we've got the governor, we've got the commissioner of the labor department, or that section of our government, and we've got all of our state house seats and about half of our Senate state house seats. Or state Senate representation seats that are coming up in 2022. So those are all things that we need to look out for and potentially start looking at getting candidates for some of those types of races, because the governor especially is expected to be the most expensive in Oregon history. And as Greens, we need to, get ourselves out there and show that we don't necessarily need all that huge money to actually get our message out and get people elected. So hopefully. And then with the House seats, I think we should try as big as we can to get as many people in as many of those races as possible, just so that we can get Pacific Greens noticed on all of the ballots. And then people start seeing Pacific Greens, and we'll maybe get some more people to come back on board to the party. And initiatives, there's some interesting ones that are actually already filed for the 2022 bill, but only 2 of them have actually been allowed to start circulating, and there's not that much information, just a judicial vacancy reform, Environmental Quality Commission Reform Act, Oregon's People Rebate. That one doesn't have much information about it yet either. So there's a few to look at. the Secretary of State website has the initiative, referendum and referral search. It looks like a really old 90s site, but it's got some good search features and ways of looking at the upcoming initiatives. And actually, a lot of initiatives that have been tried over the last few years that didn't really get the ground, even though they had plenty of signatures. So not sure what happened with those ones. So I think that's just about it for me.
Anybody wants to have a question?
I was going to provide some information on the governor's race in 2020. Bud Pierce, the Republican, has already announced that he's going to be running for governor again. Unfortunately, on the very same day that he announced, his wife was killed. She was in a roadway and got struck by an SUV and died. So I don't know if he will continue or not. But I just thought I would give you an update on, because that was something that happened here in Salem. So it might not have reached other folks.
Yes, and what I wanted to remind people is that winning an election is not just getting elected. It's also getting the message across and challenging people on the status quo. And I find that running a race is the most effective way to do that, and is extremely empowering. When I was speaking with Kenny about making a list of the races coming up for the next couple of years, Kenny and I were both surprised that neither the state Secretary of State nor the counties have a running list. You would think that to encourage participation in the electoral process, that you would be able to go to their site and see what's coming up in the next couple of years, but that information is not available. So what I was going to suggest for the Green Party is to get a couple of volunteers. So if this is something that's of interest to you, Kenny is going to be leading the effort, but to start developing like a database of the spreadsheet, and to list, all the coming elections, when the term is up, who is holding, et cetera, and have maybe 4 spreadsheets that we can just rotate every year to keep a running list of the races that are coming up for election. Anybody else has a comment? Any interest in running? I see Rhett. Where are you coming from? Where do you live? We have here Betsy from Roseburg. Betsy, are you interested or have you thought about running for office?
I tend to be more the campaign manager type of person.
Oh, good to know. Anybody else on the call who has run for office?
Well, this is Ken again, and I have run for office 3 times in California. One of the questions I was constantly asked, because twice I was running for Congress, would be that would I actually move to Washington, D.C.? And the thing is, you need to be positive in your response that yes, if I'm elected, I will go to Washington, because that's sometimes an issue for some folks to think about what happens if you are elected. Mostly though, we're going to be looking at local elections or ones here in Oregon. But you need to think about that as well, because there are some occasions where that's going to happen and you need to be positive about representing people.
Yes, likewise, when I ran for office in Texas, and somebody says, well, if you get elected as a Green, you're not going to have anybody, any peers on your legislative council, legislative body, etc. So how are you going to be effective as an executive? Because I ran for lieutenant governor. And I said, if I'm going to get elected, when I get elected for lieutenant governor, it's going to be because there's a massive movement on the ground. And that's just what's going to happen. I don't need to have, 5 or 6, or I don't need to have a majority. There's going to be a groundswell of support. So you have to be prepared when you run for races about questions that are going to be coming up that are a little bit out of your thinking. One question that came up during the Secretary of State is, what would be your leadership skills or your preparation to run for, what is your preparation to fill the shoes of the governor, were the governor to leave or to be incapacitated in any way? And you can look at the debates at my response. So you have to be prepared when you run for office to prepare for that office and be able to answer questions that may be very unexpected.
Yeah, the other thing is that I did work for a California Assemblywoman who was a Green Party member and was elected out of Oakland. One of the things that happens is now you're surrounded by a bunch of Democratic and Republican representatives. And I know that the first day when we had an open house, all the lobbyists showed up at that office, even though there was only one person in the state assembly that was a Green Party person. So, and they'll be in there every day lobbying you on various issues. And it doesn't matter if you're only representative of the Green Party in the state assembly. And so that's something also to keep in mind. You have to keep in touch with your local members and don't be listening to all the lobbyists and other representatives because that can start to influence how you look at things and like that. And you need to stay grounded. And that's been my experience in helping out at, in the office there.
So we're going to be moving on pretty soon, but to recap what we were talking about, Kenny did some research about the upcoming races and initiatives, and the information is not yet available through the Secretary of State and the counties. And so what we're proposing, we're calling for volunteers to help Kenny, is to prepare spreadsheets or databases of elected offices that we can keep updated. So we are ready to run. And Betsy brought a very important issue, is that when you run for office, you really need a campaign manager. Running for office is being out there, having the policies, the issues, being a speaker, being a presenter. And that takes a very different mindset than the campaign management, where you're plugging volunteers, keeping track of calendars, keeping track of donations. The organizing thing, it's kind of an introverted activity, whereas a candidate is kind of an extroverted activity. So you want to look into a good, couple of key allies or friends to work with you when you run a race. And again, winning a race is not only getting elected. Pushing your issues and changing the debate on the ground is just as important. And it's not because it was my race, but I encourage you to watch the debates for the Secretary of State. They were very different when there was a third wheel. It does change the dynamics. So anybody who's watching this, because we're live streaming on Facebook, I encourage you to register through pacificgreens.org and express your interest in running electoral races, because we're going to plug you in, because we're going to be running races and we're looking to focus on local races.
Natalie, can I add and support your comment about it's important that third-party people or even somebody in a Democratic primary run on the issues, because that can change the direction of the state. We saw that with the campaign finance reform. I was called a one-issue candidate. I covered a lot of other issues like homelessness and OHP for all. But in the end, when we got the governor to commit to campaign finance reform, that put that measure 107 on the ballot. And the final thing I'd like to add is next May is the school board elections in every community. And that's very important to do that first before you run for higher office, in my opinion. Thank you.
Natalie, I'd like to jump in here. So I've run for office a couple of times. I ran as a libertarian in 1992 for Congress against Ron Wyden. I had hoped to run as a Green, but we didn't yet qualify for office. I ran on an anti-war and end drug prohibition platform. I was our first candidate for governor in 1998, and I've worked on several Green presidential campaigns. I am convinced that we have to go as hyper-local as possible, and I would echo Patrick's comments about running for school board. I think we need to focus on soil and water conservation district races, school board races, uncontested city council races, anything that we actually have a chance of winning. I've run a number of elections and worked on campaigns that didn't have a prayer of winning. I think it's important to influence the debate and get into the debates. But at this stage in our development, I think nothing succeeds like success. And we should see what we can do and accomplish at the local level and use that as kind of a training ground for getting candidates to be better prepared and learn about government and run for higher level offices. But I think we could really affect policies statewide, whether it's school board or soil and water conservation district seats. Kenny, you can get in touch with me offline. There have been Greens at the national level who have done research and created spreadsheets of all local offices. And one of the best ways we can get people to run and make change is to plug in our membership from the different areas by using our state database with the database of potential seats, seeing who's in which district, and encouraging people to run for those local offices.
I have on the stack Kenny Kearns and then Connor. Kenny, you want to say something?
Yeah, so I just had a comment to go along with Blair there. Actually, I do have from the Secretary of State the 2021 local elections calendar, which says that for the May 18th election, technically the county officials have to publish by February 6th. So until that time, we can't necessarily expect them to have all of the open seats and stuff like that that things are going to be going for, but people are able to start filing in March for all of those positions. March 18th will be filing deadlines for the May 18th election. Thank you.
Connor, you can talk.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to add a statement in support of what you'd said and the other previous comment. I believe when you had your first campaign school that you offered, one of the people who came and talked was invited was my grandmother, who ran as a upset first grade teacher back in the early 70s or late 60s on the single issue of getting public kindergarten that Oregon didn't have at the time, running for state representative against incumbent Democrat who wasn't in favor of public kindergarten, and the Republican opposition also wasn't in favor of public kindergarten, but she managed to get that issue elevated, and we've got public kindergarten. She dropped out, but it ended up getting the policy change on the table.
Great. So what I wanted to do is recap, and we can leave some more of the conversation for the end. At this point, I would like to invite Blair Bobier to introduce himself and to talk about ranked choice voting and the ranked choice voting initiative. And the floor is yours. And if you have a presentation, we can share the screen.
Thank you. Good morning. Now I'm still putting my presentation together the old school way, so I'll just wing it here. So hello, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Blair Bobier. I'm one of the folks who helped get this party off the ground starting back in the late 80s, if one can believe that. And we got on the ballot in the early 90s. And I've been working with the Pacific Green Party and election reform pretty much the entire time. So I'm going to talk about potential for ranked choice voting here in Oregon, what's going on with some potential legislation and initiatives, and how Oregon's first ranked choice voting election in Benton County came about, which just took place this past November. So for folks who don't know, ranked choice voting is a voting method that gives voters more power, more choice, and brings more voices into the election system. From the standpoint of independent politics and so-called third parties, probably the most important thing is that it eliminates the spoiler effect and means that there are no more so-called wasted votes. Basically, the way it works is instead of voting for just one candidate in a race, you can rank candidates in order of preference, first choice, second choice, third choice, and so on. If a candidate wins a majority of first choice votes, that candidate is elected outright. If no candidate wins a majority initially, and a majority is 50% plus one, then basically an instant runoff takes place. Candidate with the fewest first choice votes is eliminated, and whoever voted for that eliminated candidate, their ballot is automatically transferred to their second choice. A couple of examples to illustrate this would be the recent mayoral election in Portland. One of the main advantages to ranked choice voting, in addition to eliminating spoilers, is that you ensure that whoever wins the election has an actual majority support, in some senses a consensus support. And in Portland, I believe Ted Wheeler won with 46% of the vote, meaning that most people who voted for a losing candidate. So that really is topsy-turvy democracy. The majority of the people should be voting for the winning candidate. And essentially what happened in Portland is that the anti-Wheeler vote, if you will, kind of split the vote between Sarah Iannarone and Teresa Rayford. Technically, there was the write-in votes, but presumably Teresa Rayford got the vast majority of those. And if ranked choice voting had been in place, then the people voting for Sarah or Teresa could have put one or the other as their second choice, and those votes would have combined to be a true majority, defeating Wheeler. Another quick example, and it looks like most of us are old enough to remember this, is the presidential election with Bush and Gore, which came down to Florida. And had ranked choice voting been in place, we'll ignore the Electoral College for now, but people who wanted to vote for Nader but didn't want to see George Bush in office could have put Ralph Nader as their first choice, and if they wanted, Al Gore as their second choice, meaning that those votes could have combined to again defeat Bush. Okay, in Oregon, interestingly enough, ranked choice voting has been part of the Oregon Constitution since 1908. It is in Article 2, Section 16 of the Oregon Constitution. In recent times, folks from the Pacific Green Party had lobbied the Oregon legislature to get what's known as enabling legislation, meaning legislation that would just enable the state or localities to use ranked choice voting. It actually wasn't clear that we needed that legislation because the Constitution's the law of the land, but for a long time, there were obstructionists in state government and the elections office who insisted that they would block any ranked choice voting elections that did not have this enabling legislation. Notably, that legislation never was enacted, and we got ranked choice voting and just used it in Benton County regardless. So in Benton County, we put an initiative on the ballot in 2016, which created ranked choice voting, amended the county charter, and we used it for the first time in this past election. And the Greens played a major role in having ranked choice voting come about in Benton County. Basically, we allied ourselves with Dan Rayfield, who's the state representative from the Corvallis area and is now co-chair of the Joint Ways and Means Committee in the legislature. The local Green Party chapter, the Lynn Benton Pacific Greens wanted to get something on the ballot, wanted to move ranked choice voting forward, and we decided that the best thing we could do to move democracy forward and ranked choice voting forward in Oregon was to start locally. So we teamed up with Dan. We put together an initiative. Dan and I were the two co-chairs, the two co-chief petitioners for the measure. We drafted the initiative. We collected the signatures. We put together a campaign, and we won something like 54-46. It took a few years to get the funding together and to get the voting tabulation equipment certified by the state and to get the county time to put together their education program, because you can't just switch from one voting system to another without some measure of education. So we won that campaign. We just had our first election. Mike Beilstein, a Green, ran for county commissioner and got about 10% of the vote. As it turns out, the ranked choice voting was used in 2 county commissioner races, which each had 3 candidates, and neither race really needed the instant runoff because both winning candidates won with an outright majority. So our successful effort drew the attention of some funders who have been funding ranked choice voting around the country at the national level. And probably almost 2 years ago at this point, maybe even longer, losing track of time here and COVID, those of us who were behind the Benton County campaign got approached and said, hey, if you guys are interested in making this more expansive in Oregon, we can help. So we've been working for the past few years, Dan Rayfield and I, along with Mike Alfoni, who was our campaign manager, and we've been trying to basically organize and do outreach to sort of sow the field, as it were, to make ranked choice voting something that is potential for the Oregon legislature to adopt in this upcoming session, and then a potential ballot initiative. So a lot of what we've been doing for the past couple of years is reaching out to constituent communities and constituent organizations. In our view, in order to make something successful in Oregon and authentic, we need to have broad support, and we need to have the communities involved that are going to basically benefit from this, and reach out to those communities that have basically been kept out of a lot of the democratic process as it is. Communities of color, renters as opposed to property owners, young people, people who are typically disenfranchised. So we've been doing a lot of that, as well as our strategy has recognized that the democratic establishment and the groups behind them could make life very difficult, if not impossible, if we didn't have their support or at least their lack of opposition. So again, for the past couple of years, we've been working with these different groups like Next Up, which used to be the Bus Project, APANO, Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon. We've been working with the Progressive Elections Table, which consists of different unions and Our Oregon and NARAL and Planned Parenthood, and again, a bunch of these groups that basically are in one way or another kind of the tail that wags the dog of the Democratic Party. So at this point, we've seemed to have gotten pretty good support, or at least some commitment to neutrality or openness. And the elections table, as it's called, has had a working group that's come up with different proposals on how to shape ranked choice voting legislation in the upcoming session. The table has been working with Dan Rayfield's office. Dan Rayfield's office has submitted concepts to Legislative Council, And so we're in the process of getting legislation back that Dan Rayfield will co-sponsor in the upcoming session. He's been looking for different co-sponsors, and I'm not sure what exact commitments there are, but we will certainly have other sponsors besides Dan. And right now we're looking at a handful of different concepts. So kind of working our way up the ladder from the sort of least contentious to what might be a bit of a push, are that one bill will establish ranked choice voting for military and overseas voters. And the reason that's important, and this is used in a number of other places like Arkansas and Louisiana, and I think South Carolina, is that when folks are overseas, and particularly when they're in the service, if there's going to be a race that's going to have 2 rounds, like a May primary, like they do in Portland, and then a second election in November, there's not necessarily time enough to get ballots to someone on a ship in the middle of the Pacific, and then get them back, and then get the next round of ballots out if there's going to be a runoff. So one bill addresses military and overseas ballots. Another one would require that all new voting machines purchased in the state be capable of tabulating ranked choice voting ballots. And that's kind of a nerdy technical issue in one way, but one of the easiest ways for this type of initiative to get sunk is for there not to be the cooperation of the clerks who administer the elections and to not have the equipment that can count the ballots. So that's another bill. There is the potential for a bill that would require some degree of compatibility for proportional representation. That's something else that came out, but kind of getting to the meat of the matter is there's going to be a bill introduced that would establish ranked choice voting for primary elections for the major parties. And Dan Meek can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the major party designation is parties that get, is it 15% of the vote in a statewide race, or a certain percentage of registration? In any event, at the moment, it just applies to the Democrats and Republicans, though the independent party has also reached that threshold. The other component of the proposed legislation would be using ranked choice voting for nonpartisan races in the state. So that would be potentially local races, judges, and the Bureau of Labor and Industries. So those are the legislative concepts that are in the hopper. We've had some draft bills come back from Legislative Council that I can share. The one on the primaries needs to be redrafted, and essentially, folks, if you've got your, if you still have your mics open, if you could mute them, please. What our organization, Oregon Ranked Choice Voting Advocates, is looking at doing is seeing where the legislation goes, and after the legislative session, working with the various constituent organizations that we've been working with to put together an initiative to make ranked choice voting more broadly applied. And that would be an initiative that we'd look at getting together in 2021 for the 2022 ballot. So that was one long presentation there, and I'm sure there are questions and or comments galore. So Natalie, I don't know if you're going to hop back in and moderate this, or if you want me to, but if there are questions, let's have them.
So I'm going to let you moderate. Dan Meek mentioned that the major party designation is 5% of all registered voters in Oregon. And I have Kenny on the stack who wants to speak.
So I had a question real quick, Blair. Did Benton County use any type of third-party software to tabulate and like eliminate candidates in between the counting rounds?
So Benton County used ES&S machines, which are ranked choice voting compatible. So they just used what they had from the vendor, as they're called, and they did run simulated elections in order to get the equipment certified by the state. So there were instant runoff rounds and eliminations during the simulations, the test runs, but during the actual election, candidates won outright in the first round.
Can you have a question?
Yeah, since you're working on this at the state level, does it make sense to try to get something happening in our various counties?
That's a good question, and thanks for asking it. And it brings up a really good point that Portland right now just nominated a 20-member charter review committee, and the City Club of Portland just came out with a report that recommended a number of changes to the Portland charter and the way that Portland government should run. And one of the changes that they embraced was ranked choice voting. So our website is OregonRCV.org, OregonRCV.org. There's a place to sign up there, and folks should go there and sign up. And as we ramp up, we're going to be sending out updates and putting together Zoom trainings and the like, or just volunteer meetings. But I didn't exactly answer your question. So for folks in Portland, there are groups like Next Up and Apano that are really involved, the City Club. And so I think folks should look and see what comes out of this charter review process in Portland. And for folks who are interested in getting it going on a local level, I'd say get folks together who are interested, and then you can contact me, or it's probably more efficient than contacting OregonRCV.org, just because we're basically, for all intents and purposes, a volunteer organization. But it's what I think is really important, and one thing we learned in Benton County and that we're trying to apply at the state level, is we want to win and we want to do it right. So, you know, I appreciate sort of long shot campaigns and campaigns to make statements, and I've run a number of those myself. But when it comes to ranked choice voting, we just want to make sure that we have kind of, I hate saying all our ducks in a row because I'm in beaver land, but we want to make sure things are lined up, and you know, that there isn't the opposition. I mean, there potentially always is going to be some form of opposition, but the more efficiently we can line things up, and the more professionally, for lack of a better word, that we can organize our campaigns, I think the better off we'll be. We don't want to screw up. We don't want to put up some poorly written or half-assed run campaign and then get crushed and potentially set ourselves back or reflect poorly on the broader movement. So yeah, I think that having things happen at the local level is a definite possibility, but we should research those opportunities and make sure that there's support in the communities, and make sure we know what we're doing before we go out and do it.
So I have several persons on the stack. Piggyback into what you say, Kenny Kearns is making a list of races, and so we're going to get something locally in the Portland area going. Then Meek, would you mind asking your question to Blair? You have a couple of questions. Would you mind unmuting and asking them to Blair directly? You can look in the chat, Blair. So Dan is
Yeah,
asking,
I'm getting my cheaters on for that. So Dan asks about the top 4 system adopted in Alaska using RCV in the general. And his question is, why have a primary at all if we use RCV in the general? And Dan, I agree with you. Folks can do an internet search, and boy, I don't remember what year it was, but maybe 8 years ago, I wrote an op-ed in the Oregonian where I suggested eliminating the primary altogether. And that's one of the other advantages of using ranked choice voting. And that's something that San Francisco did. So when you have 2 rounds of an election, it costs a lot of money. You know, basically one of the elections is completely unnecessary if you use ranked choice voting. And it makes elections more expensive for people to have to run twice. You discourage candidates, ordinary folks, from jumping in the races because the campaigns are longer and more expensive. So I would love to see the primaries eliminated and have everybody run in the general. I don't know that that's something, it's clearly not what's on the table for the legislature. And I suspect that as we go forward, that's something that it's already been discussed. And I kind of want to make clear to people that while I and the other core folks of Oregon ranked choice voting advocates have our own views and ideas, that we are really putting these ideas out and filtering them through the community, because we don't want to take our ideas and just impose them on the constituent organizations of youth organizations and communities of color, that it's really up to those folks to determine what is best for them and their communities and their constituencies, and then for us to kind of hash something out and see what that's going to result in. But yes, I absolutely agree. And San Francisco, just to circle back and complete that, they used to have their sort of primary local election on election day in November with the runoff in December. Well, hardly anybody showed up for the December election because it was after the regular election and people stopped caring and it was getting close to the holidays, and voter turnout just dropped precipitously. So once San Francisco eliminated that second election, they saved a lot of money and more people got to participate in the most meaningful election. And that's one of the things that ranked choice voting can do. Okay.
then Dan has a couple other questions. He has, as you can see, whether RCV was boosted in Alaska by having a provision in it that slightly reduced campaign contribution limits. And also RCV was implemented in Maine. And then on the stack, I have Chuck Fall and George Hutchinson.
Okay, so let me, okay, so there's a bunch of them here. Let me go back, scroll to the top. Chuck asked, if the legislature doesn't pass the laws, wouldn't Plan B involve asking for an enabling law? For the most part, an enabling law isn't necessary. The ranked choice voting is in the Oregon Constitution. Enabling legislation basically says, hey, you can have a statute that says you can use ranked choice voting. There's some question as to whether it might be needed for localities that are not home rule jurisdictions, but by and large, we don't need enabling legislation. So we're going to see what comes out of the legislature, what comes out of the constituent organizations, and that's how the ballot measure that at least Oregon RCV will determine. RCV has been implemented in Maine. It's kind of been a long, tortuous process because there's been initiatives and lawsuits that's gone around and around, but it is now used at a number of different levels in Maine. If folks are really interested in that, we can get more into that, but that's a little complicated. But Maine is the only state currently that uses RCV statewide. In the last election, it was approved in a handful of other places. And just so folks know, ranked choice voting is used in Oakland, it's used in San Francisco, in Berkeley, Minneapolis, and St. Paul. New York City adopted it for use that's going to be used in some elections starting in 2021. And now Alaska has adopted it with a top 4 system, which is another slight complication. So Chuck is asking.
George Hutchinson raised his hand a while ago. George, you want to ask a question? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Blair.
So where are we? Chuck asked if we have a liaison with the Black Lives Matter community. Again, this issue has been vetted extensively at the Oregon Progressive Elections Table, as it's called. And there are a number of folks from different communities of color. I don't know if what's considered the Black Lives Movement is at that table, so to speak, but there are a number of organizations that do have connections there, and outreach has been done, so I can delve more into that and get back to folks. Joe is talking about a volunteer contact list, and we are in the process of putting that together. Since the election, our website has just kind of been swamped with folks wanting to get involved. And again, we're basically pretty much a volunteer organization. We are paying some folks for different things, but we don't have a full-time volunteer coordinator. As we transition into the legislative session, we're hoping to have someone in that role. Folks can contact me offline. I'll put my email up into the chat, and folks can get a hold of me, and we can figure out how to plug people in.
Natalie Stack. I wanted to remind people that Kenny Kearns has offered to coordinate electoral research and races and work on electoral issues. Joe, I'll connect you with Kenny. And I also wanted to mention that I'm Latina, and I have been reaching out, and I've reached out to Causa, Picun, Latino Network, and some other people that I already work with, to involve them, or to not involve them, but to actually me going to them and seeing whether this is something that interests them. They're doing a lot of legislative electoral work. Joe, anybody else wants to add or have another question? Chuck, go ahead, ask your question.
So Blair, my question is, so say you go to all the you follow up with Rayfield, he takes you down the path, and in the end, the legislature says, fuck you, we're not going to do ranked choice voting anyway, anyhow. So then you explain that then Oregon RCV will go and collect signatures and put something on the ballot. The thing I understand you would be putting on the ballot would be called an enabling legislation that you get by initiative. My question is, wouldn't one of the tactics be, if the legislator and the governor reject entertaining a legislation in any form in all the listings that you did, wouldn't you finally ask them, well, if you're not going to pass it, would you at least refer it to the people for a popular vote, just like you did with the campaign finance matter? So that's my question. And you didn't, I just, could you clear that up and answer that?
Sure. So Chuck, what I want to state again is that it's not enabling legislation. That's kind of a term of art, and just you should basically, for the purposes of this conversation, erase that from your vocabulary. So yes, a referral is part of the strategy. So first of all, let me just say that we're coming into one of the most unusual legislative sessions in the history of the state. And, you know, Oregon's not alone in that. We've got an eviction moratorium that hopefully will be extended, or we could have thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of people facing homelessness and ruin. I work in Lincoln County, where the wildfires took 293 homes. You know, the legislature has to deal with COVID, a budget shortfall, and of course the wildfires that were just as devastating in a number of places. So, and the legislature doesn't even know if they're going to be meeting in person or if meetings are going to take place. So it's just going to be nuts. So in that climate, we have no idea what's going to come out. I don't think the legislature knows what's going to come out. The leadership doesn't know what's going to come out. So that is the environment that we're throwing ranked choice voting into. But yes, we will be asking for a referral if the legislature just says, buzz off, this isn't for us, then we're going to say, okay, then put it to a vote of the people. So yes, we'll look for legislation, we'll look for a referral, and again, based on what comes out of that, we will look to put an initiative on the ballot in 2022 that takes it further, unless in the unlikely event, the legislature or the referral gives us absolutely everything we want. But we're going to try and get it as broad as humanly possible.
So Blair, if you were going to summarize 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, what are the key steps that you foresee the campaign moving forward? And I have then Ken on the stack and Chuck on the stack. Then is going to speak afterwards on campaign finance reform. He'll probably want to have a say also on ranked choice voting and maybe other voting systems. So again, if you can recap 3, 4 steps, then I have Ken, Chuck on the stack, and then Meek is going to come to speak about campaign finance reform and Measure 107.
Sure. So basically, right now, there is legislation that is being drafted and will be introduced. Okay, that's step number 1. There will be ranked choice voting legislation introduced into the 2021 Oregon legislative session. Like any legislation, we don't know if it's going to go anywhere or how broadly there will be support for it, but it certainly will at least get introduced and likely get a hearing, and I think there is support for it. We will also, as Chuck has pointed out, ask for a referral if the legislature chooses not to take action on this, and if, depending on what comes out of legislation and or a referral, we are looking at a likely ballot initiative in 2022 to take things either further, or if no action is taken by the legislature or by referral, to put something comprehensive before the voters in 2022. I also want to point out to people the City Club report, which is on OregonRCV.org, and that City Club report is probably going to be used as a basis for some of the action of the Portland Charter Review Committee, which has recently been formed and which I know contains a number of advocates for pro-democracy reforms, including ranked choice voting. Okay, and then we have Ken.
Yes, I just wanted to let you know that the Oregon legislature is hiring people for a virtual session. I know this because my intern at the radio station has applied for it. So they are at least counting on a bigger presence with virtual hearings and so on. So I just wanted to add that. Also, I would imagine that we should be lobbying our state representatives and senators to take up this measure.
Yeah, I think yes. I think what's going to be important is to see what the shape of the legislation is. It's always good for representatives to hear from their constituents, but when we see what the legislation is, and I'll kind of have a bit of a nose count and where the legislators are that are most in need of persuasion, and I will be in touch with folks. I will use the PGP discuss list on email, so sign up for that. So go to the pacificgreens.org and sign up if you haven't, and also sign up at OregonRCV.org, and then you'll be on that email list and get updates. And then do we have Chuck back in the stack? And I think that's the last one before we turn things over to Dan Meek.
So 2 questions, Blair. One is, could people in Portland lobby that charter group, or is it kind of like, do they work in a hermetically sealed environment and have their discussions about those pro-electoral reforms? Or could an activist group kind of encourage and call out and protest, hey, let's do this? Is that available or not, prudent or not? And then the other question is, well, so that's the other one is then the prospect for a encouraging PGP members and others in the progressive community to be actively engaged as, call it, citizen lobbyists, to essentially turn on to aggressively speaking to our elected people and just messaging and sending out communications and using the website that Natalie set up on volunteers and encourage this. So 2 questions: lobbying the Portland Charter Review Group, and then generally encouraging citizen activism around lobbying the legislature.
Yeah, so as Dan Meek has put into the chat, they will have, the Charter Review Committee will have public meetings. Lobbying is definitely on the table. Folks can use typical outreach and persuasion, call in to talk shows, create your own media, use social media to the extent that things are still done in person. You can do that, organize forums, but yes, show up and speak out. And in terms of citizen lobbying, yes, absolutely. Again, let's wait and see what specifically is introduced. I don't think it pays just to say, hey, we're going to the legislature, we're telling people we want RCV. Let's see what the bills are, what the numbers are, because my experience in working with folks in the legislature and lobbying them is that basically you want to send them like a letter or an email that says, yes, on Senate Bill 555. And hi, I'm a constituent. I support Senate Bill 555. Anything beyond that, they're going to start falling asleep or ignore. And basically what they're going to do is take a tally of the yes on Senate Bill 555s or the no on 555. So let's get the actual bill numbers and see which legislators really need the pushing. And we'll all stay in touch and push the citizen aspect of this together. So I think we should wrap it up there, Natalie. Thanks everyone for putting this together and hosting, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Dan Meek has to say. I know that Dan may introduce himself and Natalie may, but I just want to say that I'm really glad that Dan's joining us. Dan has been at this longer than I have, and he is one of the staunchest advocates for democracy and campaign finance, and he is an excellent, amazing person to have in our corner. He has supported these efforts in every way possible, and a brilliant lawyer. And thanks, Dan, for joining us.
Okay, until then, oh, okay, Dan, you're on. Then we cannot hear you. So until then, now we can hear you. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Okay.
You're muted then. Yeah, you're muted again.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Perfect. Now we can hear you.
Okay. I'll skip the bad joke that I just told and just go to the slideshow. So if Natalie would give me access to share the screen, I will do that. Just a second. Let me make sure I got it right.
You can share the screen. And as you share the screen, I just want to make people know that we will put a tab on our pacificgreens.org dedicated to campaign finance reform and also to RCV. So we'll have that information and ways to link in through our website. Go ahead, Matt.
So can you all see the little table there?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, just a little bit of history and then the current situation in Oregon. I've been working on campaign finance reform in Oregon since the Supreme Court in 1997 came out with this unique decision that the Oregon Constitution somehow does not allow the imposition of limits on campaign contributions. Oregon, of course, has exactly the same free speech clause as 37 other states, and no other state court has come to that conclusion. And as we'll find out a little bit later, after 23 years of litigation, the Oregon Supreme Court finally agrees with me and has concluded that the Oregon Constitution, as it exists before Measure 107, doesn't at all prevent the adoption of limits on campaign contributions. In fact, the free speech clause of the Oregon Constitution doesn't even apply to campaign contributions. But the situation as of, let's say, late 2015, the Center for Public Integrity and Public Radio International did a large state integrity investigation, and it rated states in various categories for fighting corruption. And you'll notice that Oregon got an overall F grade. In particular, it got an F in political financing and actually in everything else except legislative accountability, where it got a D minus. Among the, let's see if I can get this thing to, there we go. It also ranked the states in each of these areas as far as efforts to prevent or combat corruption. And it ranked Oregon 49th in political finance regulation, meaning that the Oregon system was ranked the worst in the country, except for Mississippi. We barely beat out Mississippi for having the worst system. Of course, the main reason our system is evaluated as being poor is because there have been no limits on campaign contributions. Here's an illustration of what effect that has had. In 1998, the spending on Oregon governor's races was about $2 million. And in 2018, it was $40 million, with each candidate spending about $20 million. Newt Buehler received from Phil Knight $3.425 million from a single individual. That is the third largest campaign contribution in the history of the United States, coming from someone who is not the candidate himself or the candidate's spouse, immediate family. Huge. He also got more than $3 million from the Republican Governors Association, large amounts from various corporations that you see on this chart. There are many others in the range of $250,000 of either corporations or wealthy individuals who contributed to the Newt Buehler for Governor campaign. But when it comes to large contributions, Kate Brown basically matched him. They both relied extremely heavily on contributions of over $50,000 each. Kate Brown received $2 million from the Democratic Governors Association, which is financed primarily by corporations, unions, and wealthy persons. She also received nearly $1 million from some other PACs, $750,000 from Michael Bloomberg's Everytown for Gun Safety, etc. So they both used very large contributions and received almost none of their money in contributions of $500 or less. The same thing has happened in Oregon legislative races over the same period of time, about $3 million in 1996 and up to $30 million in 2018. And year 2020 is probably going to be higher, but the National Institute on Money in State Politics hasn't compiled all of the data for 2020 yet, so I can't give you that chart. But I can show you the average spending by the top 10 candidates for the Oregon Senate and Oregon House in each of the last 4 cycles before this year. As you are probably aware, most Oregon legislative races are not in that either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party has a very high registration edge. So basically, active campaigns are not run in most legislative districts in Oregon. There's usually about 10 or 12 competitive or active campaigns on the House side and usually 3 or 4 on the Senate side. So looking at the top 10 candidates is really where the money is going. And you'll notice that in 2016, for example, the top 10 candidates in the Oregon House spent an average of $825,000 each. That's works out to about $70 per vote. The Oregonian did a little study a few years ago and concluded that on a per capita basis, Oregon legislative races are the most expensive in the United States, except for New Jersey. Does money make a difference? Yes, it does. For the last several cycles, about 94% of the time in Oregon legislative races, the candidate who spent the most money won the race. And the money spent predicts the outcome better than any other factor. It even predicts the outcome better than incumbency. Now, you might think, well, all that's bad, but there's a balance in Oregon between corporate money going to Republican candidates and union money going to Democratic candidates. But in fact, there is no balance. As this table from the Oregonian shows, in legislative races from 2008 through 2016, you can see from the blue bars that the Democrats received most of their campaign contributions from corporation and industry groups. That's the first column there. And received less from labor unions, about half as much as they got from corporations and industry groups. And that's not to mention big individual donors, the third category, which obviously is not coming from labor. So there isn't a balance. The balance works out to about 3-to-1 business over labor when it comes to overall contributions, and 2-to-1 when it comes to even contributions to the Democratic candidates. And the real problem is that money selects the candidates in Oregon, and that's the real primary. The real primary is that the business associations and the unions recruit candidates who are ideologically consistent with them, and then they fund those candidates. You don't then need to get any quid pro quo, corruption, because you already have a person who agrees with you in office. So it is the selection of candidates by the money, or the money primary, that I think is the biggest problem. So Honest Elections is a loose coalition of organizations and individuals, came into being around 2014. First thing we managed to do was in 2016, get a measure on the Multnomah County ballot, a charter amendment. And Blair was talking about the Portland Charter Review Committee. We got this on the ballot to the Multnomah County Charter Review Committee, which meets every 10 years. It was quite a push. There were many public hearings. We had many people testify, and then the committee finally took a vote to put it on the ballot, and the vote was 7-6. So we almost didn't get this on the ballot in 2016. What it does, it prohibits all campaign contributions in Multnomah County races by corporations and other entities. limits individuals and PACs $500 for any candidate in any race. It allows the creation of small donor committees that can aggregate contributions, but they have to be $100 or less and only from individuals, and requires that the 5 largest true original sources of funds be prominently disclosed on political advertising. So once we got on the ballot, we ran the biggest campaign we could. I think we ended up spending maybe $20,000 on the campaign, and we won with 89% of the vote, which was a surprise to us as well as to others. So I figured, well, here's some of the supporters. There weren't a lot of supporters out there. Progressive Party, Green Party, Working Families Party, NAACP, Sierra Club, Teamsters, Multnomah Democrats, certainly not the state level Democrats. 350 PDX were the main supporters of this. We also, so notice that basically no labor except the Teamsters. So we decided, well, let's do this in Portland too. So we went out and collected the 50,000 or so signatures we had to get in Portland. That's the verification of those signatures is a whole different story, but we barely qualified and got on the ballot and then won with 87% of the vote. Basically the same provisions as in Multnomah County, and you'll see the list of it there. Many more supporters here. League of Women Voters came along. Jobs with Justice, which is a labor organization. The National Association of Letter Carriers came along. APANO, Aorta, Alliance for Democracy, a lot of additional supporters than we had before. Even more. Tax Fairness Oregon, etc. Healthcare for All Oregon. So the coalition has been growing. The press endorsements we got were interesting. We got the usual, I guess, liberal weeklies or tabloids, the Mercury, the Scanner, Willamette Week and Street Roots. And strangely enough, some of the best reporting about campaign finance locally in Oregon comes out of the Scanner and Street Roots. They actually do a more comprehensive job than others. And then look at the bottom. We actually got the endorsement of the Oregonian. This is the first time the Oregonian has endorsed a campaign finance reform measure in my memory, and the Oregonian endorsed against the Multnomah County measure, which was essentially the same. So over that 2-year period, the Oregonian changed, and of course the reason for that is that Eric Lukens left. He was the head of the editorial page there. He left to go be manager of the Bend Bulletin, and the Oregonian got a new editorial editor, Laura Gunderson, totally different. And the Oregonian has now been taking more liberal positions on several issues, and particularly on campaign finance reform. It's unsettling to have the Oregonian as an ally. I've never had that before. Now the Oregonian will print my op-eds. So, they'll do editorials in favor of bills I like. It's kind of very strange. Got to be something wrong there. Anyway, as I mentioned before, the Oregon Supreme Court then in 2020, in litigation to challenge the constitutionality of the Multnomah County measure, we got that the Supreme Court pretty quickly, and the Supreme Court in April of 2020 said we were wrong in 1997. That decision was wrong, and the Oregon Constitution doesn't prevent limits on campaign contributions. So that was good. In the meantime, the Oregon legislature, I think largely as a result of the persistence of Patrick Starnes and others, but particularly Patrick was quite annoying, I think he quite persistent. The legislature referred to voters Measure 107, which just says the legislative assembly or a local government can enact laws or ordinances that limit contributions made in connection with political campaigns. B, require the disclosure of contributions or expenditures. C, require that an advertisement identify the person or entities that paid for it. Then D, limit expenditures to the extent permitted under the U.S. Constitution. So The supporters of Measure 107 were largely the same as those of the Portland measure, but notice more labor. SEIU, OEA, the AFL-CIO. For some reason, the OEA is in there twice. Anyway, and here's more supporters, basically the same as our Portland measure, and many others. Measure 107 finally brought along the state Democratic Party, which had never endorsed limits on contributions. It brought along the conventional good government groups like Common Cause and Augsburg, and a whole bunch of additional labor unions, as you can see there. So a movement that started out basically with the Progressive Party and Green Party ends up having a very large coalition, and it won with right at 78% of the vote. So one important aspect of it, by the way, is it also clarified that the Oregon Constitution allows what we call taglines on political advertising, that is requiring that the actual funders of the ad be identified in the ad, like in our Multnomah County and Portland measures. Each of those requires the top 5 funders to be identified if any of them, which is, it's basically a stopgap to the contribution limits. The contribution limits are enforced, then there's no one making the big contributions, and so you don't have to disclose in the ad who's making the small contributions. So the legislature, the basic task of the legislature is going to be to adopt limits on contributions in the next session. And there are a variety of bills in process at Legislative Council and elsewhere. These are illustrative contribution limits in governor races. Actually, some are pretty low, like Alaska's 500, Colorado 575, Connecticut 250. These are applicable to individuals and generally also to political committees, but each state is somewhat different, and most states ban completely contributions by corporations and direct contributions by labor unions. Labor unions have to have a political committee, and then they're limited to these amounts. So those are governor limits. These are limits in states to legislators. Again, these are the lowest limits. Notice Colorado is only $200, Alaska 500, Connecticut 250, the liberal bastion of Kansas 500. It's strange that some of these low limits are in very conservative states. A lot of states limit contributions to legislators to $1,000 per person or political committee, including South Carolina, South Dakota, West Virginia, Idaho for even as that limit. So in the 2019 session, the legislature made an attempt at adopting limits. The House passed HB 2714. It didn't pass the Senate, mainly because the Senate walked out and didn't pass anything, as you'll recall. The walkout was supposedly to avoid a vote on the global warming cap and trade bill, but I think it was also to avoid campaign finance reform votes. So this was what the House came up with. It was mainly a vehicle pushed through the House by Dan Rayfield, and the limits are higher than I wanted by about double, but the main problem was the loopholes. Regardless of those numeric limits, it allowed unlimited money to flow into the legislative caucus committees and political party committees, and allowed unlimited amounts of money to flow out of those committees as well. This is a chart that you probably can't read, so I'll send a copy to Natalie. But the pink items are the unlimited loopholes, the kind of transactions that are allowed that the Rayfield bill would have put no limits on at all. So basically, the caucus committees would be left the way they operate now, which is they get their money mainly from of course, big contributions from corporations and unions, but also they assess dues on the individual candidates. So if you're in a fairly safe district, you still have to raise several $100,000 in your Senate or House race, but then you pay that to your legislative caucus committee, and they redirect money to the candidates, to other candidates who have more competitive races. So they left those loopholes open, and if you can see at the bottom, the second to the bottom row is Oregon federal candidates even allow state party committees and caucus committees to take unlimited amounts of money from federal candidates, like for the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. I don't know any state that allows that, but so that's the problem with them. As I mentioned, allowed candidate committees to give unlimited money to political parties. Other states don't allow this. 11 states ban it. 5 states have limits of $5,400 or less. 10 states have somewhat higher limits. It also allows political party money to go to candidates in unlimited quantities. Again, 11 states have the same limits as on an individual. 4 states have a multiple of anywhere from 2 to 10 times on an individual contribute. 15 states have limits, except, and the same thing. The regular would allow unlimited money from candidate committees to caucus committees. Most states don't even have caucus committees. Others only allow candidates to give money to caucus committees after the election is over, and only if there are funds left over in their campaigns. Oregon allows caucus committees to give unlimited amounts to candidate committees under the bill. So just a quick review of disclosure, which is another thing that the legislature needs to do. They passed 2 bills in the 2019 session that are borderline meaningless on disclosure. Oregon doesn't have a great disclosure regime. Here's a map showing the states in green that do require political ads to name their sponsors. Notice Oregon is one of 5 or 6 states that does not still. These states require that political ads identify their monetary sources. Usually the top 5, sometimes the top 3, sometimes the top 8 have to be in every ad for or against the candidate. Some cases they also apply to ballot measures. And the legislature passed a bill. This is a bill in 2019 to have taglines, but it does almost nothing. It doesn't apply to candidate campaigns at all. There's a candidate can take money from any source and run ads and not say that the money came from anybody. So the main thing for this legislative session is to get something done on both the limits and on taglines on political ads, so that we get into the range of what's being done in places like Washington, it's had taglines for many years, and Colorado, which has seems to have a very good set of contribution limits. So I'll end there and take questions. I hope I wasn't muted that whole time.
So if you were to recap 1, 2, 3, what are the 3, 3, 4, what are the 3 areas where we can be most effective in helping this pass, or what do we need to look at?
The first thing is to get the Oregon legislature to pass a good bill in this session, 2021 session, for limits on contributions without loopholes and requiring taglines on political advertisements, and I would say including for ballot measures. That's the first part. That's really the overwhelming priority. If we can't get that done, then we're going to have to run a ballot measure in 2022. And in order to run a ballot measure in 2022, we have to start now. So we really have to go down 2 parallel paths, trying to get the legislature to do something, but at the same time, proceeding with all of the requirements and mechanisms to get a ballot measure for 2022. And I think that our main leverage at the legislature, apart from the persistence of Patrick Starnes, is the fact that we have shown that campaign finance reform is extremely popular, with 87% and 89% of the voters in and around Portland, and even 78% of the voters statewide. So that's the task.
Anybody else? Anybody else has a question?
I had one before that, maybe I would just one other interesting thing, potentially interesting thing. You'll notice that in the national press for the last few days, there's been reports of a Department of Justice inquiry into bribery for pardons, that is, the payment of campaign contributions in exchange for pardons. Let's see if we can, 57, hang on a second.
Yes, I have been reading.
Oregon, yeah, Oregon, I'm almost there. There we go. Oregon has a bribery criminal statute. It makes it a class B felony, which is like, 10 years in jail, $200,000. It's a big fine, big penalty. A person who commits the crime of bribery, if you offer, confer, or agree to give a pecuniary benefit to a public servant with intent to influence the public servant's vote, opinion, judgment, action, decision, or exercise of discretion in an official capacity, like voting on a bill or getting a government contract or whatever. That sounds pretty good. Same thing for bribe receiving. It's also a class B felony if the public servant takes the bribe, takes anything of pecuniary benefit, or even solicits, even asks for something of pecuniary benefit. Well, that sounds great until you read the definition of pecuniary benefit. It means a gain or advantage to the beneficiary or third party pursuant to the desire or consent of the beneficiary in the form of money, property, commercial interest, or economic gain, but does not include a political campaign contribution. So in Oregon, it's actually legal to bribe public officials with campaign contributions expressly. You can have a contract with a government official, say, I will give you $1 million campaign contribution and you will give me a $10 million government contract. That's legal in Oregon, only in Oregon. Oregon, the leader in corruption, and I mean that seriously. Oregon is the leader in corruption. And no, it just has to be reported in accordance with ORS Chapter 260. Well, not really. The Oregon Court of Appeals issued a decision about 10 years ago. Said, no, it doesn't. Even if it's not reported, it's still not illegal to use a campaign contribution to bribe public officials in Oregon. So there you go. There's various studies all the time attempting to measure the level of corruption in state governments. And they usually rank Oregon as being very non-corrupt. But if you look at those studies, uniformly, those studies measure corruption by counting up the number of convictions for corruption type offenses. Like bribes, that's a corruption type offense. But in Oregon, you can't be convicted of a bribe for using the campaign contribution to bribe a public official. So you can't be convicted of it. Therefore, according to those studies, Oregon is the cleanest state because it has no convictions. Well, it has no convictions because bribery is legal in Oregon. Unlimited except in Multnomah County and in Portland, unlimited campaign contributions are legal. So what Tom DeLay did in Texas and was indicted for, legal in Oregon. What Michael Cohen did in making a payoff to Stormy Daniels, legal in Oregon, perfectly legal in Oregon. So these corrupt political folks, they don't know where to go. They could come to Oregon. They love it here.
So Blair has a question. Blair, go ahead.
Thanks. Dan, I'm curious what you see that has been the historical opposition in Oregon to campaign finance reform. And I'm wondering what you see as current opposition to something going forward.
Historical opposition has been I would say a 50-50 proposition. 50% the corporations, 50% the labor unions. Labor unions have been, particularly the public employee unions, on a statewide level, have been against it. We occasionally get locals to endorse it, like the firefighters, and sometimes the carpenters, and sometimes others, and Teamsters, even statewide Teamsters have endorsed our measures. The big change is that I think the labor union folks saw a couple of things, maybe three things. They finally realized that Phil Knight is out there, and that Phil Knight can finance anybody's campaign with a stroke of a pen. So they finally recognize that there's a problem in having unlimited contributions. The second thing they recognize is that unless they get involved in shaping campaign finance reform legislation, that they're going to get limits that they don't like, because we're going to write them. They're not, and not them. We'll do it with ballot measures, and ballot measures for campaign finance reform are extremely popular and at this point and difficult to beat. And the third element, of course, going forward, is Patrick Starnes, the annoying factor of Patrick Starnes, going to every conceivable meeting all over the state and advocating for campaign finance reform.
Thanks for the intro, Dan.
Yeah.
I would like to. Yep. I'm impressed if I annoyed Dan Meek. That's a hard thing to do.
Dan, so what about opposition going forward?
The Measure 107, for example, was not actively opposed by anyone other than the Libertarian Party and Kyle Markley, who was their Secretary of State candidate. I think all of the business organizations saw the writing on the wall. They couldn't beat it, so why spend money against it? They must have done their own polling to find that out. So very little opposition to it. I think there might possibly have been an editorial in the Bend Bulletin against it, but all the other papers endorsed it, as I recall, any of them that took a position on it endorsed it. So the main opposition, I think, but you have to now differentiate between good reform and bad or meaningless reform. Everyone basically got behind Measure 107 and the Portland and Multnomah measures, but the problem in getting the legislature to do something is exemplified by House Bill 2714 from 2019. Giant loopholes. Basically said, well, we'll limit other people. We, the legislature, will limit what other people can do, but we're not going to limit what we do. We're still going to do the same thing, and we're going to still spend tens of millions of dollars on legislative races. So the main opposition to a good bill, I think, is going to be the legislators themselves, and they are going to, and the opposition will be the business community, because they want to keep the legislators in their pockets. And in order to do that, they're going to need loopholes. And whether the unions support or oppose it depends upon specific provisions. The unions in particular, like the small donor committee provisions that I put in the measures dating back to 2002 and proposed in actual measures, including Measure 47 in 2006 and both the Portland and Multnomah County measures. If the small donor committee provisions are adopted, I think the unions are in favor of a bill with very few or no loopholes. The corporations certainly are not. They're going to want loopholes that allow big money to flow in, particularly to the legislative caucus committees and also to statewide candidates. So there will be much greater opposition to a good bill with the legislature than there was to Measure 107. And because you're dealing with the legislature and not the voters, the corporations will have a lot more influence. at the legislature than they had on Portland or Multnomah County voters.
Natalie, can you put me on the stack?
Sorry, I had to take a little break. Go ahead. Go ahead, speak.
I just want to talk about the next stages I'm working on. Dan mentioned the lobbying at 2021. We can start that immediately with reaching out to our reps and our state senators, because there are over 20 states that have limits on no corporate money, and they have also limits on no PAC money. And I'm arguing for a bill that's simple, that has those two limits, no corporate money, no PAC money, and also a $1,000 limit. In my governor's race, I had a $100 limit, but I realized that $1,000 at that level may be a little higher. Dan, I think, likes 500. Those details can be worked out. The second thing I'll be working on is, since Measure 107 was the most popular across all 36 counties, the lowest percentage in favor of it was in Lake County with 60%. So we're going to be reaching out to different counties to immediately put on the ballot for 2022 in their county, a county initiative like Dan did in Multnomah County. So Dan, we're going to be sending you a lot of for your help. So I hate to be annoying again, but you'll probably have 36 counties trying to get you to write their legislation for their county initiatives. But we just have to keep the momentum going with such popular support. It's bipartisan support. Even I grew up in red counties. I currently live in a red county. And it's surprising how in Douglas County, where I grew up, it was 68% in favor of Measure 107. So that's one of the counties that's working towards a county initiative, because these counties struggle with candidates with big timber dollars. You know, and I know later you're going to be talking about the Elliott Forest, and we've also been wanting to debate about the LNG. So to wrap up, ask your legislator to have a simple bill with a $1,000 limit per individual, so only voters should donate, and no corporate money and no PAC money. So that would end all this handing money back and forth. And secondly, you can contact me if you need help getting your county initiative. I'm at 541-671-7829. Thank you, Natalie, for putting this together.
Oh, no, my pleasure. Dan, I muted you because you were typing and it was going over Patrick's voice. Do you want to talk a little bit about the honest election campaigns and how to plug in? I know that as a Green Party, I'm looking for a volunteer from within the Green Party to represent us at the Honest Elections campaign and to report back what's going on, because there is actually a lot going on at the Honest Elections Coalition.
Yeah, 1 second. First of all, I'm glad to hear about Patrick's efforts with the counties. It's important that any bill passed by the legislature doesn't preempt the counties from adopting their own limits. I think we can argue that under Measure 107, the counties have direct constitutional authority to adopt their own limits because Measure 107 expressly refers to them. But the legislature might try to, at the urging of the corporations, might try to preempt local limits, saying, you know, the limit for all local races is $10,000 or something, and you know, create loopholes for local races as well as create loopholes for statewide and legislative races. So that, again, we have to watch out what happens at the legislature. The honest elections, if you can see my slides there, that's the address, honest-elections.com. And we have meetings. If you go there, you can sign up for our email list, and then you'll receive notification of our meetings. We have meetings every week, usually at 5 o'clock on Tuesdays. And the meetings usually last about an hour, and we discuss everything that's going on the campaign finance reform front in Oregon, All of the good government groups are represented there, like League of Women Voters and OSPRC and Common Cause, as well as a lot of people who are involved in the Portland and Multnomah County measures and Portland Forward and other very helpful folks with experience at the legislature. So if you want to get involved, the best way is to either go to honestelections.com and sign up for the list, or just send email to info@honestelections.com, and I'll put you on the list. I'll put you on the email notification list, and then you'll get the you'll also be able to come to the meetings on Tuesdays. We are currently using Zoom for those meetings.
I see a question from Christian Havana. Christian, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question directly? And also, I just wanted to reiterate that I'm looking for a volunteer from the Green Party to attend the meetings and report back, because we want to be very active in this.
I wanted to be as thorough as possible in ensuring that we also ensure that like special interest dark money is not allowed within this. And I was just curious if these measures would allow like on a county level, how can we ensure they're also part of this?
The Portland and Multnomah County measures basically ban independent expenditures. They set the amount that can be spent by anyone or any entity at a very low level. But of course, under Citizens United, that's not allowed under the U.S. Constitution, according to the U.S. Supreme Court. So, and the Oregon Supreme Court has recognized that. So those are the limits on independent expenditures, and those measures aren't being enforced. But what is being enforced are the tagline requirements, so that the folks who are putting money into those campaigns have to be identified, along with the businesses that from which they derive most of their income over the past 5 years. So the taglines have been enforced to some degree in the Portland and Multnomah County races. The Portland City Auditor has done generally a bad job in enforcing them. The tagline requirements in the Portland measure are very specific about font sizes, contrasting colors, the speed of the speaking voice, the size of the TV screen, etc. And many folks violated that. Mainly the Ted Wheeler campaign was the overwhelming violator of the tagline requirements. The city auditor only responds to complaints. There were dozens of complaints against the Wheeler campaign. She found about half a dozen violations and fined the Wheeler campaign, a few $1,000s, maybe a total of 10 or 15,000, not very much. She applied the wrong fines, the wrong level of fines. So we've got a dozen of those cases up in Multnomah County Circuit Court, appealing her decisions to either not impose a fine or to have a fine that's too low. But all you can do at this point is require a lot of disclosure, a lot of disclaimer on independent expenditure ads, and urge the Democrats in the U.S. Congress to add 4 members to the U.S. Supreme Court, which they can do.
And of course, Alliance for Democracy Move to Amend want to challenge the fact that money is not speech, but money is property. So eventually we'll have to take this fight further up. Kenny, you want to mention something? You had a mention, you want to introduce yourself and mention something about Measure 107 on the voters pamphlet?
I was just saying that it is very interesting, as Dan said, that there was not a lot of opposition from big business people, because they can easily get statements put into the voter pamphlet. It's, a couple $1,000s is nothing for those big money interest groups, but they decided, nah, we can't really oppose this because there's too much voter support for it.
Yeah, I think 14 of the 16 opposition statements in the voters pamphlet were put there by Kyle Marks of the Libertarian Party. And if you read those, apparently, Kenny, you've read those, several of them are highly misleading, because he lists and restates quotations from a variety of groups about how it's bad to amend the Oregon Constitution to allow limits on political contributions. He, has quotations from Planned Parenthood and NARAL and SEIU and AFL-CIO, etc. But in fact, all of those groups supported Measure 107. All of the quotations he used were from 14 years ago. And all of those groups have changed their position since then. So a lot of the opposition statements are just in the voters pamphlet were just horrendously misleading.
So again, if you want to take part in the Honest Elections campaign, we are looking for a volunteer to represent us at the weekly meetings and report back. You're on the screen, you have the link on how to connect with that coalition. And you can also go to pacificgreens.org or to the Independent Party if you want to, and sign up to be part of this initiative. And I want to mention that Kenny Kearns, who spoke earlier on, is kind of taking the lead a little bit on some of the initiatives and list of elections going up in the next couple of years. And so is Joe Rowe, who expressed interest in helping with ranked choice voting. So with this, we're going to take a few minutes break, unless somebody else wants to continue speaking and participating in the conversation.
I'm on the stack, Natalie.
Oh, I didn't see. Go ahead.
So Dan, it sounds like you don't have much confidence that you're going to get very far on legislative matters in 2021 coming up from the legislature. It sounds like the legislators are, in fact, the biggest opposition to moving forward on this.
I would say that from the experience in 2019, yes, getting good limits is at the Oregon legislature will be very difficult. The legislators who are there were elected in the big money system. They obviously, are quite compatible with the big money system, and changing to a small money system is, going to be risky for them, and they will probably oppose it.
So, so in all probabilities, it sounds like ranked choice voting may have better chances of getting any legislative progress than the campaign finance is likely to face. Is that a fair kind of?
I think that's probably true, and particularly if and when the progressive parties become stronger, like the Oregon Progressive Party and the Pacific Green Party, because that will cause the Democrats to support ranked choice voting, because that will the stronger the left-wing parties, the more likely that Democratic candidates will get quote unquote spoiled. And if you have ranked choice voting, then having strong left-wing parties doesn't make as much difference to them.
So very brief, and then in closing for me, is there any champion? Is Rayburn a champion for the campaign finance stuff, or is
I would say that our champions for low limits and no loopholes are Jeff Golden on the Senate side and Andrea Salinas on the House side.
Okay.
Can I add in, Natalie, about his question?
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Natalie, can I add into about that question he had about?
Go ahead.
The actual structure of the party leadership is all based on big money. You get a chairmanship of a major committee because you raised a lot of big money. So the higher you are in those leadership positions, the more problems for us. So it's actually the nature of the beast is a problem too. So if they changed it to have small donors electing us, that's going to change the whole structure of the Capitol. So I just wanted to point that out, that your possible representative may be a chair of a major committee because they got a lot of big pharma money. Thanks.
Go ahead, Blair.
So I just want to add that it did not go unnoticed where our Green candidate at the coast got a certain percentage of the vote, and the Republican wound up winning there. So I just want to echo Dan's comments that wherever Greens run and run strong, that is seen as a threat to the establishment, and that is one of the more effective ways to bring the power structure in favor of ranked choice voting, is when they see that it helps them, and having strong progressive parties are actually a threat to them. So, and you know, in terms of what might come out of the legislature, I think we just have to wait and see, because no one really knows how the ranked choice voting bills are going to fare. I think based on past experience, do they have a better chance than some of these campaign finance reform bills? Probably. But, you know, the legislature, as the famous saying goes, is basically a sausage grinder. So we'll put bills in there, but we don't know what they're going to look like when they come out.
One other thing for me is that you'll notice that the Libertarian Party is doing better and better, and that's a threat to the Republicans. So maybe that will cause them to support ranked choice voting.
I have Betsy on the stack. Betsy, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm actually a precinct committee person in the Democratic Party in Douglas County. I have been a registered Green Party member, actually helped found the chapter in Douglas County 20 years ago. But there are a lot of progressives in the Democratic Party these days. It doesn't sound like the connections are being made, but there are people working at the state central committee meeting to get these kind of changes that you've been talking about. So, and a few of my fellow PCPs are also in this call from Douglas County. The one thing I think, you know, we live in one of the most red counties, but our Dems tend to be really, really progressive.
Dan here, I would say that certainly county level and local level Democrats are very progressive on this, typically endorse our measures. The statewide Democratic Party, not. Until recently, they haven't endorsed campaign finance reform at all, and to the extent they endorse it now, they're not on board with low limits.
Well, I think that there are people that are on the state central committee that represented that are, and it's around a 50% level. So I don't think you should write off even, although I'm not really active in the state party, I do local political stuff.
You know, Betsy, if you know anybody in particular, feel free to give us the names, because I think that it's all about connecting with each other. I'm beyond party affiliation. I think that we have much more pressing issues than just having party affiliation be a matter. So I'll work with anybody with whom I share the views, be them Republican or Democrat or Libertarian for that matter.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely I'll connect you with the folks who are working on these particular issues that are actually in the state party central committee delegates.
Yeah, because I find that you sometimes you have to work from within, and sometimes you have to put pressure from without, and both positions are really very important.
Hey, Chuck's on the stack. Can I just another question for Dan and Betsy, and that is, in making an appeal to a Democrat to support, the legislations for the campaign finance, and yet so they've received big money. What appeal can you possibly make when the thing you're asking goes against their interest? What's an argument for that appeal to someone who's in deep with the deep dark money type stuff? How do we win them to do work against their interest, rhetorically speaking?
Well, by convincing them that the arms race doesn't help them. There are many Democratic candidates who raise and spend a lot of money just because their opponents raise and spend a lot of money. And then they both spend their money on TV ads that go basically to people outside of their district anyway, for the most part. I don't know if you're in Portland, but in Portland, the airwaves were saturated with state, house, and Senate races in October. But we need to convince them that they can do well if everyone is everyone's contributions are limited. So they don't have to go out and raise $500,000 to $1 million to run for a House seat in Oregon if their opponent can't go out and raise $500,000 to $1 million. So it's kind of like arms control. We need to somewhat disarm both sides at the same time.
Yeah, so we're kind of closing the loop on our roundtable on electoral reform and campaign finance reform. And I cannot thank you enough, Dan and Blair, for just such fantastic presentations. We're going to look into editing them and posting them online, maybe hosting watch parties, because we do want to get more people involved. And if any of you are interested in taking part in these campaigns, please sign up through pacificgreens.org, or you can also go to the Independent Party or the Progressive Party. We work very closely together. We, as a Green Party, want representation in these coalitions, so you can report back and we can be proactive with these actions. We're actively looking for people to take that couple of hours every couple of weeks to get engaged.